Good evening, and thank you all so much for coming out. I hope you didn't have to dodge any hailstones or all the prom goers who were outside, but the sun has come out. I'm Nancy Edwards. I'm Curator of European Art here at the Kimball, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening. Amanda Dosseth is the Linda P. and William A. Custer Director of the Meadows Museum at Southern Methodist University. Dr. Dosseth was appointed director of the Meadows last year after a long and fruitful association that she has had with the museum and SMU, where she received her MA in the history of art in 2006. In her early years at the Meadows, she was a curatorial intern and research teaching assistant, and then assistant curator. She then went to London to study at the Courtauld Institute of Art, completing her PhD in Romanesque architecture in 2015. She returned as a Meadows, Mellon, Prado postdoctoral fellow and was successively named a curator, interim director, and then director in 2023. Amanda has held fellowships with the Fulbright and Mellon Foundations, as well as the Spanish National Research Council, among other honors and awards. Her research focuses on medieval Spain, but she's addressed a wide range of topics, including Baroque painting, medieval treasuries, and collecting history. This breadth is apparent in the range of exhibitions to which she has contributed. They include Fernando Gallego and his workshop, the altarpiece from Ciudad Rodrigo. This was a very important exhibition that examined this fascinating altarpiece's production from several perspectives. Amanda worked with the Kimball's Director of Conservation at that time, Claire Berry, and others, and she's worked closely with our Kimball conservation staff on several projects through the years. She also curated El Greco Goya and A Taste for Spain, highlights from the Bose Museum in the UK, Canvas and Silk, historic fashion from Madrid's Museo del Traja, and also Murillo, picturing the Prodigal Son, an exhibition that coincided beautifully with the Kimball's Murillo exhibition that opened shortly thereafter in 2022. And also two big names, Dali and Vermeer, a dialogue. And now, a warm welcome for Amanda, who will speak tonight about our wonderful museum neighbor to the east in her talk entitled Algur H. Meadows and his Prado on the Prairie. Welcome, Amanda.
Hello to all out there in the dark abyss. I can't see you very well, but I'm delighted to be here. I'm so happy you made it. You braved a tornado watch, and I appreciate you. And as Nancy said, who I would like to especially thank Nancy for inviting me to give this lecture. As she mentioned, I'm actually a specialist in Romanesque art, but we decided this topic was perhaps a little bit more relevant to this audience. So every institution is shaped by its place and by its people. And the Meadows Museum's story is in many ways one that's very stereotypical of Texas, where the joke, as you know, has long been that everything is bigger. Bigger fortunes, bigger foibles, bigger philanthropists. And at the heart of this tale is just such a philanthropist, Algur H. Meadows, who was referred to in his New York Times obituary as, quote, one of the country's most successful independent oilmen. He used that success to create, as he put it, quote, something of immortal value for Texas, And as we shall see, it was almost by coincidence that Spanish art came to be a key part of that vision. Although born in Vandalia, Georgia in 1899 and educated in Louisiana, it was in Dallas, Texas that Meadows eventually made his home and his fortune. Following the discovery of oil fields in East and West Texas in the 1930s, the city's economy began to rely less on agriculture, namely cotton, and more on something else that sprung forth from the earth, petroleum. Then as now, Dallas benefited from its central location between America's Pacific and Atlantic coasts, but it was the city's proximity to the newly discovered oil fields of West Texas that put it on the map. The decades preceding the Second World War bore witness to the great Texas oil boom. For those of us not from Texas, like yours truly, this part of 20th century American history might as well have been the stuff of myth. Dallas could have been Mount Olympus with the roles of Zeus, Athena, and Hercules, played by Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, and James Dean, the three actors who starred in the 1956 film Giant. I mention the movie not merely as an amusing pop culture anecdote, and not to mention a confession of my own ignorance of Texas history, but because its exaggerated cast of characters and plot present an interesting parallel to the story of Algur Meadows, who represented a generation of entrepreneurs that stood on the shoulders of an earlier generation of giants. Indeed, the movie's story begins in 1926, and it's just around that time that Meadows founded a loan company, General Finance, not in Texas, but in Louisiana. He and his partners transformed it into General American Oil in 1936 and moved the headquarters to Dallas the following year. With the move, Meadows made sure he was in the right place at the right time. He had developed a new method for financing the acquisition and development of oil-producing properties, and as a result, General American Oil grew rapidly. A little over a decade after its foundation, it was ready to expand its reach internationally. Throughout the 1950s, the search for new oil fields was critical, and General American owned some 3,000 wells across 15 US states. It is perhaps not coincidence, then, that Giant premiered in 1956, just as Algur Meadows sought to expand his business by looking beyond our national borders. Having consulted a renowned geologist from Midland, Texas, Meadows cast his eye on Spain as a potential source for new fields. And I'm just showing you a geological map of Spain to emphasize the fact that it wasn't a completely crazy idea to look for oil there. Indeed, General American Oil would become one of the first US companies to operate in Spain following the Second World War. Despite alliances with Hitler and Mussolini, Spain had officially remained neutral during the war as it sought to recover from its own devastating civil conflict, which had ended in 1939, with General Francisco Franco, who you see in this creepy image on the screen, appointing himself as dictator. Having solidified absolute autocracy by the 1950s, Spanish foreign policy became more outward-looking. Franco, long a staunch enemy of communism, now strategically courted Western democracies with whom he could boast a kind of "I told you so" rhetoric in the face of the escalating Red Scare. For its part, the United States sought allies in its Cold War against communism, not to mention a military foothold in Southern Europe, which of course it got in Rota, Spain. America was likewise ready to accept the Francoist propaganda machine's claim that Spain was a modern, quasi-democratic, or democratic enough, maybe, nation-state. Fascist regimes have always had a real talent for propaganda, as we know, and Franco's was no exception. The Spanish government served up a banquet of cultural and industrial progressivism, just as America's appetite for like-minded allies reached a peak. Spanish abstract artists like Saura on the left and Guerrero on the right were encouraged to represent their country abroad as symbols of free artistic expression, and did so to great success in government-sponsored exhibitions, but were discouraged and even persecuted at home. Foreign tourism was also sought and encouraged, and I should add that foreign tourism continues to be one of Spain's most lucrative industries. The country industrialized rapidly, and the ground was laid for the so-called Spanish miracle, as the rapid technocratic-led economic boom of the 1960s and 70s is known. And its symbol, incidentally, is the Seat 600, which you see immortalized in a sculpture on the screen. And this car, the Seat, was manufactured in Spain and was the country's first sort of everyman vehicle. And so it was into this political and economic climate that Algur Meadows looked to Iberia for a new source of oil. He subsequently signed a contract with the Spanish government for oil exploration there, drilling primarily in the southern part of the peninsula and in Spain's North African territories. Most relevant to our story, however, is that his business in Spain necessitated extended trips to a country as eager to welcome tourist dollars as it was Texans in search of oil. Accompanied by his wife, Virginia, the couple stayed at Madrid's elegant Ritz Hotel, located on the fashionable Paseo del Prado and next door to Spain's great national museum, the Prado. And for those of you who don't know Madrid, I just brought a map so you can see this is the Ritz, then as now, and just across the street here is the Prado Museum. So these micro-geographies do actually matter. As Meadows said later, and I quote, "You're bored, with nothing to do, and so you stroll over to the Prado and learn so much about each painter. To me at the time, I thought it would give certain elegance to my home, a few old masters. Besides, it would be foolish to be around this great Prado Museum and not pick up some of the works by painters they had that still must be there, right? I never thought I'd be so thankful for another man being bored. But of course, we at the Meadows are. On a deeper level, however, these extended visits inspired a love for Spanish culture, and the couple began building a collection for their home in Dallas. Over the next 15 years or so, the Meadowses began to buy art in Spain, where Algur enjoyed the thrill of haggling prices with dealers and negotiating export permits with the Spanish government. He often bundled or traded paintings to achieve the desired price and focused his purchases on artists like El Greco and Goya, and works by key 19th century Spanish artists like Vicente López y Portaña, who was the court painter to follow Goya. And on the left, you have José Jiménez Aranda, and of course, Joaquín Sorolla. For American collectors, the Meadowses were unusual, if not unique for their time, in the fact that they were buying these artists in Spain in the 1950s. And I'll just remind you that most of the major collections of Spanish art in the US, the ones that ended up at the Met, the National Gallery in Washington, and the great Midwestern museums, were formed a generation earlier, at the turn of the 20th century, during America's Gilded Age. And I refer, of course, to the collectors who formed these collections: Carnegie, Frick, Mellon, Kress, Hearst, etc. General American Oil did discover black gold beneath the dusty Spanish soil, but never in quantities large enough to make its extraction, profitable. Even so, for his efforts, Meadows was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Civil Merit by the Spanish government for his, quote, collaboration and efficient help in the oil exploration of Spain. And the medal itself is actually on display at the Meadows Museum in the Founders Room here, where it's accompanied by portraits of Algur Meadows, his first wife, Virginia Meadows, and his second wife, Elizabeth Meadows. The legacy of the Meadows' discovery of Spanish art, however, proved much more enduring. Sadly, Virginia Meadows, who on all accounts had been her husband's partner in collecting Spanish art, died unexpectedly from cancer in 1961, And it was in the wake of this loss and following his remarriage that Algur Meadows donated his Spanish collection to Southern Methodist University. The gift included a $1 million endowment for the construction of the Virginia Meadows Museum within the School of Art, which the couple had supported prior to this major gift, and would later be named in Meadows' honor. The museum opened to the public in April of 1965. And it's a bit hard to tell in this photograph, but this is the original Meadows Museum, and this portrait was hanging right at the entrance at the top of the stairs. By this time, Algur Meadows had remarried, and it is his second wife, Elizabeth Meadows, pictured here, hard to miss in this hat. She was from New York. He had married his second wife, Elizabeth, and her taste is quite different than Virginia's. She preferred Impressionist paintings and modern sculpture to the religious subject matter of the Spanish school. This couple, Algur and Elizabeth, set about, therefore, building a new, more modern collection for their homes in Dallas and Palm Beach. At the time of Meadows' gift to SMU, the Spanish collection had been valued at $3 million. However, the opening of the new museum marked the first time the works had been exposed to public scrutiny, at which point it became clear that many, if not most, of the painting's attributions were rather more aspirational than they were accurate. I'm being polite. Some were period or modern copies, some were simply in terrible condition, others were outright forgeries intended to deceive the unwary buyer. It was a revelation Meadows must have felt most acutely, not only because the donation to SMU had been highly publicized and celebrated, but because it was around the same time that Meadows also learned that much of his recently formed collection of Impressionist paintings were fakes created by the famous forger Elmire de Hory. The story made national news, with one Time magazine article citing his purchase of dozens of both Spanish and Impressionist forgeries. Meadows, however, responded to the scandal with remarkable candor and characteristic humor. When asked what he would do with the fakes, he said, I quote, "I might build me a room on the side of my house in Dallas. It will be the My Experience with Fake Paintings room. I'd add just one more picture, one of myself, and I'd call it Mr. Sap." Sadly, Meadows' fake paintings room was only a jest. In fact, most of the misattributions or forgeries were sold or destroyed as part of the litigation that followed. But I'm happy to say we still have a few in the collection, and we use them for teaching purposes. And you see here a would-be Goya and a would-be El Greco on the screen. Meadows once good-naturedly referred to his missteps as a collector in the terms of their parallel in the oil business as, quote, drilling dry holes. Something perhaps particularly amusing, as a friend of his once quipped that it was for doing literally that, drilling dry holes, that Meadows had been awarded Spain's Grand Cross of the Order of Civil Merit. Clifford Irving, the author of the book Fake, detailing the Elmire de Hory forgery story, put it another way, rather unkindly, saying, "Boys will be boys, and Texas oil millionaires will be Texas oil millionaires." In any event, it was in the wake of this scandal that Meadows vowed to start over and rebuild the Spanish collection. And here is where we get a sense of Mr. Sap's extraordinary character, his resolve, tenacity, and grit. He was quoted, again in Time magazine, saying, "One thing I know, I'm no damn expert. You won't find me buying paintings ever again without the advice of a museum director." And he was true to his word. In 1967, Meadows hired William B. Jordan, who you see here, shortly after he arrived at the museum. Jordan was the inaugural director, and the 26-year-old native of San Antonio had just completed a PhD at the Institute of Fine Art at New York University. There he had worked with renowned Hispanist José López Rey. And Jordan, like Meadows before him, therefore found himself in the right place at the right time in Dallas, Texas. Between Jordan's appointment to the directorship and Algur Meadows' untimely death in 1978, the two built what remains to this day the museum's core collection of Spanish art. In a dozen years, and I'll just repeat that, 12 years, that's it, Meadows reputedly spent some 3 times more on rebuilding the collection and in creating what he called a tiny Prado for Texas than he had spent on the initial collection. They added key works by some of Spain's most celebrated Renaissance to modern masters, such as this one by Juan de Borgoña, and you can see this massive panel being unpacked at the old museum. They also purchased Fernando Yáñez, a student of Leonardo da Vinci, 3 paintings by Velázquez, Murillo, Goya, Picasso, and Meadows. This is what we still refer to as the founding collection, which, although guided by the holdings of Madrid's Prado Museum, encompassed a wider chronological breadth, even including living artists. One amusing anecdote from this period is Meadows' visit to the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York, where he went with the express purpose of buying works by Meadows. While perusing the paintings on offer, he was approached by none other than Joan Miró himself, who personally advised the acquisition of the 2 paintings you see on the screen. A drawing inscribed here to Mr. and Mrs. Algur Meadows affectionately is evidence of the friendly relationship between collector and artist. This story also, however, highlights a decided change in Meadows' collecting practices. He and Jordan were not buying primarily in Spain, where export permits were increasingly hard to come by, but from reputable galleries in New York, especially Wildenstein and Company. And it was this gallery that approached Jordan to offer the Meadows Museum a truly remarkable work by an artist that had long eluded Meadows, El Greco. It must have been a particular sore point for Meadows in the forgery scandal that every single would-be El Greco he purchased turned out to be false. And you'll remember this false friend we saw earlier. Indeed, the Greek-born painter who spent much of his career in Toledo was among the couple's absolute favorites. Of seeing El Greco's colorful paintings, Meadows said, "With this type of display, he must be considered the world's greatest." El Greco was therefore certainly a priority for Jordan as he set out to build the Meadows Museum's collection. And it took him a decade of searching, but in 1976, Jordan finally found the perfect El Greco for the Meadows Museum. An exquisitely painted portrait demonstrating all the things that might indeed make El Greco the world's greatest: confident, loose brushwork, the distillation of the sitter's psychology, a vision in black, satin, and sable, a work of mannerist mastery. And I hope you recognize this painting I have up here. Anyway, spoiler alert. Jordan enthusiastically presented it to Algur Meadows as the ideal sole representative of El Greco's work for his university art museum. The $3 million price tag, however, was less than ideal. Remember, Meadows had spent $3 million on his entire collection before giving it to SMU. So after months of conversations between Meadows and Wildenstein, the acquisition was not to be. The Kimball Museum acquired this painting in 1977. That same year, Bill Jordan wrote to his counterpart at the Kimball, Rick Brown. He said, "Dear Rick, I regret that I am unable to get over to Fort Worth to see one of my favorite pictures again. I wanted to write and congratulate you on a super purchase. The El Greco, which I have seen numerous times, is a masterpiece and one of the most thrilling portraits of the 17th century. I had tried for a year to get Al to buy it, but he just felt the price was too steep. At least I won't have to go far to see it, and I will probably cry my heart out every time I do. Yours, etc." As stories of the one that got away go, this one still stings, I have to say. In fact, it wasn't until 1999, some 2 decades after Meadows' death, that the Meadows Museum finally added the requisite El Greco to its collection. One cannot help, and by one I really mean I cannot help but want to cry my heart out, thinking how well Dr. Francisco de Pisa would look at the Meadows Museum. Algur Meadows, on the other hand, was more stoical about the loss. He consoled his young director, saying, "Don't be sad, Bill. It's only 30 miles. You can go see it whenever you want." What the two couldn't have known at the time was that Algur Meadows would pass away unexpectedly only a year later. And not long after that, Bill Jordan did take himself 30 miles west to Fort Worth, where he joined the Kimball as its deputy director and curator, reunited at long last with his beloved El Greco. During the first half in the 1980s, under the direction of Ted Pillsbury, Jordan kept on buying excellent Spanish pictures by Melendez, Murillo, and Velázquez. But sadly, well, for me anyway, they weren't for the Meadows Museum. When it comes to Algur Meadows, it's far too easy to fixate on the foibles, the losses, and on forgers and their fakes, on Texas oil millionaires being Texas oil millionaires. But as we have seen, to Algur Meadows, his acquisitions of art and talent, and even his fondness for a bargain, changed Dallas and Fort Worth forever. Because of him, Dallas and Fort Worth can collectively boast one of the best collections of Spanish art outside of Spain. Algur Meadows changed the artistic landscape. Consider, for example, his donations to the Dallas Museum of Art, which include works by Manet and Morisot, Pissarro, Monet, but also Modigliani, Rothko, Krasner, Stella, and I could go on. Even back at the Meadows Museum, Algur and Bill were also responsible for building a collection of modern sculpture that reflected the taste of Elizabeth Meadows. The Elizabeth Meadows Sculpture Collection features monumental and in some cases truly exceptional works by Henry Moore, Rodin, Marini, Mayol, Oldenburg, and David Smith, among others. This is all to say that in just over a decade, Algur Meadows had a major hand in putting North Texas's art museums on the map. The Meadows Foundation continues this legacy today. Even during the key period of growth for the Meadows Museum between 1966 and 1978, Algur Meadows was working largely through his foundation, which he had established with Virginia in 1948. So the philanthropic vision was very early in Meadows' life. The couple had only one son, but Algur had 5 sisters, and they, together with their children, were to serve on the foundation's board, and their descendants continue to do so. It was the Meadows Foundation, working together with other key Dallas philanthropists, that in 2001 funded the construction of the museum's new building in a prominent location on SMU's Bishop Boulevard. The structure was made to match the collegiate Georgian architectural style consistent with the rest of campus, but does feature a kinetic sculpture by celebrated Spanish engineer and architect Santiago Calatrava. This was the first monumental work by the Spaniard in the US, and it paved the way for Dallas's 2 Calatrava bridges. The inauguration of the new building was a major milestone for the Meadows Museum, not only because of the significant increase in space it represented, but also thanks to a visit from King Juan Carlos and Queen Sofia of Spain. The new structure has made it possible as never before to accommodate exhibitions and educational programs, as well as the significant growth of the permanent collection. Over the past 2 decades, which coincide with the tenure of my predecessor, Marc Roglan, who passed away in fall of 2021, the museum's collection of Spanish art has nearly doubled in size. Key acquisitions include works by canonical Spanish artists, as well as somewhat less well-known ones, including, you see on the screen, Juan de Carreño y Miranda, Bartolomé González, another portrait by Vicente López Portaña, one of Goya's final portraits, one of his last portraits of his grandson, Maria Blanchard, Dali, and Fortuny, in this case, Fortuny's last painting, as well as works on paper and sculpture. Key acquisitions include, oh, I already read that. The museum celebrated major milestones, including the development of a partnership with the Prado Museum, which loaned El Greco's Pentecost in 2010, something that would have certainly delighted Algur Meadows. In 2015, the museum celebrated its 50th anniversary with the exhibition of two of Spain's most significant private collections from the Dukes of Alba and the Abelló family, helping to establish the Meadows Museum as the center for Spanish art and culture in the United States. Most recently, we celebrated the foundation of the Custard Institute for Spanish Art and Culture. Operating as a department of the Meadows Museum, the Custard Institute was established thanks to a gift from Linda P. and William A. Custard and matched by the Meadows Foundation. The Institute represents a significant expansion of the museum's already robust research initiatives and held its inaugural symposium last autumn. So I think we can rightly say that Algur Meadows built ever so much more than a tiny Prado for Texas. And I can't help but note that the word for meadow in Spanish is Prado. So somehow I imagine there's some sort of fate working here on Algur's side. He built a thriving cultural institution that engages diverse local and international audiences, enriches the lives of North Texans, and even without a portrait by El Greco, houses one of the most significant collections of Spanish art outside of Spain. That is, Algur Meadows built a true Prado on the Prairie. Thank you.